On the 30th of January 1649, on a cold afternoon in London, with one swing of the axe, a king lost his head. King Charles I was the King of England, who would lead his country into civil war through his stubbornness and unwillingness to negotiate and speak with Parliament. Charles believed he had a divine right of kings, and that God had bestowed upon him the power to rule and govern, and he believed he was above the law. This mentality led him to freeze out Parliament a number of times when he disagreed with them, and he would then, following the loss of the English Civil War, be imprisoned and captured. But for his actions, Charles would be sentenced to death. One of the most remarkable documents secured his fate, and this was the death warrant of the king. Join us today as we look at this, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. The English Civil War had been raging on for around a decade, and following the First English Civil War, it was accepted that the king had been able to justify his fight, and that he would be entitled to limited powers under a new constitution. But then the Second English Civil War erupted, and resulted in defeats for the king, and also his imprisonment. Charles was held responsible for the unjustifiable deaths and blood which was shed all across England, in the deadliest conflict ever fought on English soil. It's believed up to 6% of the entire population were killed in battles, sieges and skirmishes related to the conflict, with other estimates saying a few less were slaughtered, and in making war against Parliament, Charles I was held directly responsible for the deaths. But Charles was held inside Carisbrooke Castle and in other prisons, and then a decision was made to bring him to trial. Parliament wanted to bring him to justice, and the king was brought back to London to stand trial. Charles was accused of treason against England by using his power for his own personal interests rather than the good of his people, and it was said, for accomplishment of such his designs and for the protecting of himself and his adherents in his and their wicked practices, to the same ends have traitorously and maliciously levied war against the present Parliament and the people therein represented, and that wicked designs, wars and evil practices of him, the said Charles Stuart, have been and are carried on for the advancement and upholding of a personal interest of will, power and pretended prerogative to himself and his family, against the public interest, common right, liberties, justice and the peace of this nation. The indictment said he was guilty of all the treasons, murders, burnings, spoils, desolations, damages and mischiefs to the nation, acted and committed in the said wars, or occasioned thereby. The trial of the king began on the 20th of January 1649 inside of Westminster Hall, and this was a shock, as this was a King of England being forced to come to court to answer charges which could have led to his execution. Charles was obstinate in the courtroom, and when he was given the chance to speak, he refused to enter a plea, and he claimed that the court had no power and jurisdiction over a monarch. He believed that he was above the courtroom, and he said, "I would know by what power I am called hither. I would know by what authority, I mean lawful authority." Charles maintained that the House of Commons could not force him into making a plea, and he refused to enter a plea on many occasions. He said, "No earthly power can justly call me, who am your king, in question as a delinquent. This day's proceedings cannot be warranted by God's laws, for on the contrary, the authority of obedience unto kings is clearly warranted and strictly commanded in both the Old and New Testament. For the law of the land, I am no less confident that no learned lawyer will affirm that an impeachment can lie against the king, they all going in his name, and one of their maxims is that the king can do no wrong. The High House is totally excluded, and for the House of Commons it is too well known that the major part of them are detained or deterred from sitting. The arms I took up were only to defend the fundamental laws of this kingdom against those who have supposed my power have totally changed the ancient government." The court, however, assumed that the king would have pled guilty, and they continued with the proceedings with this in mind. Charles became so frustrating in court that he was actually banished from proceedings after 3 days, and then in private many witnesses were heard, including those who had been victims of the persecution and actions of the King's Royalist Army and their war crimes. On the 26th of January 1649, the court proclaimed that the king was guilty, and they then sentenced him. The judgment read that, For all which treasons and crimes this court doth adjudge that he, the said Charles Stuart, as a tyrant, traitor, murderer, and public enemy to the good people of this nation, shall be put to death by the severing of his head from his body. This was a huge moment, as the King of England was now being put to death for his crimes and for waging war against his subjects and people. This was a seismic moment in English history, but then it came to sign the King's death warrant, and this was drafted up. It was said that, with 67 present, the sentence was passed, and the whole court stood up and owned it. But the death warrant of the King specifically read, "Whereas Charles Stuart, King of England, is and standeth attainted and condemned of high treason and other crimes, and sentence was pronounced against him by this court to be put to death by the severing of his head from his body, of which execution yet remained to be done. There are therefore to will and require you to see the said sentence executed in the open street before Whitehall, upon the morrow, being the 30th day of this instant month of January, between the hours of 10 in the morning and 5 in the afternoon of the same day, with full effect, and for those so doing this shall be sufficient warrant, and these are to require all officers and soldiers and other good people of this nation of England to be assistant unto you in this service, given under our hands and seals." But this did go through a number of tweaks and alterations, it's believed. For example, words were erased, such as "upon this day was," and there were efforts to hide the amendments. The court also ordered that the draft of the death warrant should have been said, with a blank for the manner of his death, indicating the sentence being beheading. This was later decided, and typically the King could have been subjected to a much rougher death, as traitors like he was were usually hanged, drawn and quartered. This amendment to the death sentence was made as they believed the manner of the execution method, specifically being hanged, drawn and quartered, would be too brutal, and they then settled on beheading later. There was hesitation on the actual method of the King's execution. However, the death warrant of the King was then signed by 59 commissioners and judges who had been part of the King's trial and also demise. Signing these were key parliamentarians such as Oliver Cromwell, the King's nemesis, and Henry Ireton, another commander in the army. The first signature was John Bradshaw, the head judge or the president of the court, and he, along with Cromwell and Ireton, would later, following the restoration of the monarchy, be subjected to a posthumous execution, where their remains were dug up and were then hanged in chains and beheaded at Tyburn. Thomas Grey, Lord Grey of Groby, was the second signatory, with Cromwell being third. Edward Whalley was fourth, and further MPs and other commanders were signatories. These men would be hunted at the restoration of the monarchy, and there were a number of commissioners who did not sign. These were men who attended the court sessions, but for some reason avoided signing the King's death warrant. The signatures would come back to haunt many of these men, as they would be hunted when Charles II came onto the throne. Charles II was the son of the executed king, and he would launch an attack on the regicides, those men who signed the death warrant, and a number of these were executed after their arrests and seizures, but others had died and were posthumously executed or were just left to rot. Many of these men would flee England, but there were some who would hunt the regicides. The document itself sealed the execution of the king, which took place on the 30th of January 1649. Each of the men signed their names, and then a wax seal was applied, but the execution of the king was described as one of the most shocking sights in history. Charles was beheaded by an unknown executioner outside the Banqueting House in Whitehall, and this was one of the most controversial actions in the canon of English history. The Commission would go further, as they would refuse Charles's remains to be buried inside of Westminster Abbey, the resting place of kings and queens, and because of this Charles would be quietly interred in the same vault as King Henry VIII and Jane Seymour, the Tudor King's third wife, inside of St George's Chapel in Windsor Castle. But the death warrant of Charles I was a brutal and barbaric document that led to the execution and axe coming down on the neck of the king that plunged England into civil war. It was signed by 59 commissioners, each of which can be considered executioners in their own right, as they would arrange the death of King Charles I. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.